Good evening, folks. Just wanted to stop in with you and share a few thoughts over a recent experience I had a few days ago. Recently, there was a debate on Calvinism hosted by a YouTube user, A.K. Richardson, um, basically on the idea of free will. Does it exist or does it not? And in case you don't know, A.K. Richardson is a Church of Christ preacher, evangelist. His opponent was Derek Pauley. Derek Pauley is the Orthodox Presbyterian. That kind of gives you an idea where they're coming from. But as you know, as if you've followed me on my channel before, Church of Christ apologists advocate for absolute full, free, libertarian free will. Nothing is acted upon by outside influences, like spiritual or supernatural. It's all just regular influences. And Derek would argue that one does act according to his will, but he also acts according to his nature, and that's overrun also by the sovereignty of God. And there was a point toward the end of the debate about the 2-hour mark where question and answers from the audience could be submitted. And they were submitted on Facebook for both opponents and also on YouTube. And I submitted mine on YouTube. My question was directed toward AK because I thought I had a insight here that I could point out something that's often overlooked, especially by those who haven't been a part of the Church of Christ perspective as I have been and came out of that perspective because of these issues. And one of the big points that AK used in this debate is based off of John 6:44. Basically that to show that one is converted solely by the Word. Not by, as he would say, as just the Spirit only, which is not what Reformed theology states. That's been covered elsewhere, but that's his view of it. For him, it's either the Spirit only or the Word only. There can be no mixing of the two. Basically, John 6:44 says that what went on in Jesus' ministry was fulfillment of Isaiah the prophet, that they should all be taught by God. And that goes to explain about being drawn from the Father, that no one can come to me unless they have been drawn by the Father. And then the one who is drawn is who's going to be raised up. But he's got his own spin on that. I'll let him go over that, and then we'll look at the text. But I wanted to ask him a question directly off of verse 45. Because that's the conclusion that Jesus draws of the point that he made in verse 44. AK wants to focus on the first half of verse 45 without looking at the second half. So I want you to hear my question, and it is detailed. There is nothing unambiguous about it, and then I want you to hear his answer. Here we go.
Okay. You got a question for me?
Are you ready?
I am ready.
Okay. John 6:45 states, "It is written in the prophets, and they will all be taught by God. Everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me." It's your position that the first half of the verse means the Spirit works solely through the Word with no outside influence. If that's true, how is it everyone who has heard and learned will come to him?
All right. So that's my question, complete question. Please notice that I specifically stated that I wanted him to reconcile his interpretation of the first half with the second half, and I correctly identified the Church of Christ perspective that the only way one is saved, and this also happened in the time of Jesus, they would use, or also in the time of the apostles, even with this issue about miracles, that the primary way, the way salvation happens is through the conduit of the Word. The Spirit inspired the words brings to salvation. Now watch how A.K. Richardson takes the question. You can tell he struggles with it I don't think he's been given this kind of challenge before. He, instead of answering verse 45, he goes to verse 44. Check it out.
God, the Spirit doesn't just work through, in this time you got to remember there were miracles. The miracles were also something that is causing people to believe in the Word. The miracles were meant to verify who was speaking. And he was saying, if you don't believe me for the miracle's sake, which of course would be impossible if they couldn't. The miracles are supposed to point to the Word, and the Word itself is supposed to open people's hearts, but it is not supposed to be irresistible. Okay, so, and then he says, those who come, then I'm trying to process the last part of your question. It doesn't say those who are drawn necessarily come. That's not what the grammar says. That's not what it says. It says, no man can come unless drawn, and I will raise him up. Raise who? He that comes. It refers to he that comes who is drawn. It isn't saying no man can come except drawn, and those that are drawn necessarily will come, and therefore I will raise him up. It just says no man can come except drawn, and then implied those who come are going to be raised up. There's nothing in the grammar that says those necessarily drawn will be raised up, those that come being drawn. And he says in John chapter 5, if you believe not my words, how will you believe? Or if you believe not Moses, how will you believe my words? God is using the miracles and revelation and causing them to believe in, that's time.
Okay, so you can see, instead of answering my question, he decides to take it and morph it into something else. Now, he knows this is a debate on Calvinism versus his view of these issues. He knows what's meant by the Spirit works only through the Word. These topics have already been brought up. I think he's just trying to make the questioner look bad just because he's reformed or whatever. This guy, he's pretty much self-styled himself as a Calvinist critic. He's the Calvinist answer man for the Church of Christ, as he's trying to bill himself as these days. Check out his channel. It's pretty much nothing but talking about Calvinism. But I want to walk through what I was asking and go over with you what my question was and why I asked it. Okay, so my question centered around John 6:45. Okay, backing up here to verse 44. No one can come to me unless, there's a qualifier there, universal qualifier, unless this condition is made, the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. Now, this is pretty typical on their side. He borrows a lot of arguments that other anti-Calvinists make. He wants to argue that in between this hymn and that hymn, there's a change. And he inserts all that theology right in there in between that period and that space. But there's no change in him. No one can come to me, so there's a no one, unless that condition is met. The Father draws him, and it's the same him, and I will raise him up on the last day. So whoever is drawn is the one who is raised up. And that can be proven by going to verse 45. Now this is where they'll try and get us at, where it says, it is written in the prophets, and they will all be taught by God. And they'll say, well, see, being taught by God is not like a better felt than told experience. It's by the Word of God. That's a classic argument. But the last half of verse 45 is what Jesus used to explain what he was talking about. Here's this conclusion. Everyone who has heard and learned, okay? If you hear and you have understood the message from the Father, they would say just through the Word, and we don't deny that the Spirit of God works exclusively through the Word, or primarily through the Word. You can't divorce the two. It's both and. Everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Everyone. Now, let me pull up the Greek here, so you can see this. Actually, there's one point of it that makes this just a little bit more clarifying here. And here's, it has been written in the prophets, and they will all of them, be taught by God. And everyone, pos ha akusis, everyone who hears from the Father, and mathon, learns, comes to me. Nomic verb. It happens all the time. Everyone who hears from the Father and learns comes to me. So this is Jesus interpreting what he gets out of verse 44. But no, AK wants to make something else out of verse 44 and then ignore my question on verse 45. The last half of verse 45 explains the first part of 45 and is an explanation of verse 44. Okay? Now this isn't just exclusive to John, and I'm going to wrap up this video with this point. In fact, this came up in the debate a little bit about the parables, on the parable of the sower. And this is one point I think that people don't see a lot because they're not from the Church of Christ experience, so they're not going to put these two together. But in Jesus' explanation of the parable of the sowers in Matthew 13, if you go down to verse 23, as for what was sown on the good soil, okay, these the good and honest hearts, and this is what they stressed: it's a good and honest heart. The reaction is the soul. The soul is what determines everything. This is the one who hears the word, and here's this what happened in John 6 again, understands it. This is the one that actually sprouts and bears fruit and yields all kinds of different kinds of fruit as God wills. So the difference between those are the people who fell away or were choked out by the worries of the world or were taken up by the birds all comes down to hearing and understanding the message. They would argue it was people who of their own free will chose to get in and they just left. Jesus' interpretation of what's going on is the one who hears and understands. In John 6, the one hears and the one who has learned from the Father comes to me. All of them. Every single one. Now, for AK, he might think that's an unpleasant thing to hear. I can't help it. It's what the Word says. He may not like being called out on it, but he's not the expert on Reformed theology that he thinks he is. For his problem is one criticism that I keep coming back to with this group. They major on a few verses and they are unable to put together the forest issues. They don't like doing systematized theology. When you try and put it all together, you have to make your interpretations of each verse fit. And in this case, the person I asked the question to has not done his homework, and it's been conclusively proven so. I hope this helps you out. God bless.